Hello, everyone. This past Christmas Eve, as the news coverage covered different cities around the world, and as I was watching, one of the things that caught my attention was this news reporter that was going around and asking people about their New Year's resolutions. And so some people had something to say and others did not. And well, one of the people said, sort of stuck out to me, and then he says, this person said, well, what's the point? He says, I never keep them. And that does line up with stats that by the end of the year, it's like, I think 92% people have not kept their New Year's resolution. Now, I understand in reading that New Year's resolutions aren't anything new, that the ancient Babylonians had New Year's resolutions, and it usually was they would tell the people that they owed money that they were resolving to pay their debts, and the right to get back on track fiscally. And the Romans, they made promises to live more moral lives. What does the Bible have to say about this subject, whether New Year's resolutions or something along that line? What does the Bible have to say? Well, where do we go when we want wisdom? Where do we want to go when we need a strategy, you might say, for life? Well, one of the books in the Bible that is sort of designed that way to help us have a sort of some, you might say, some points to be successful. And it's written in large part by one of the most successful people ever to have lived. Famous in his time, learned from a very famous person that sort of was like the guy in that community and in that race of people, that nation of people, for centuries. And so we would go to the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs opens up with, he says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel. And you might say, contrary to what we might think about some of our politicians, Solomon had a reputation not for being an idiot or anything negative, but being for very, very wise. And people would travel from all over the place to speak with him, to meet with him. And this is what he says. He's written some things down, and he says, the Proverbs that are right are for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, to learn how to behave in a way that bodes well for you. He says to give those people knowledge and discretion and then be able to pass it on. And he says, let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance. But fools, he says, despise wisdom and instruction. And so Solomon basically says, right, if you want to be a fool, well, just close the book. Click stop. But if you want to be known and develop wisdom and understanding and discernment, he's keep tuned in, keep reading. And he begins by saying in verse 8, listen, my son, and he's talking to his son here, listen to your father's instruction and do not forsake your mother's teaching. And he goes on and he talks about how this is just such a good thing, it will be a good thing for him. And we get to chapter 4 is where I want to take us. And chapter 4 today, as we think about this topic of planning ahead for a new year. And what we see, he talks about, again, he says, pay attention. Okay, pay attention. This is a critical piece, that it's very easy to just drift through life or get so busy with life, work, children, families, hobbies, whatever it is, that we stop paying attention maybe to the most important thing that sort of undergird all these other things. He says, pay attention and gain understanding. I'm going to give you some sound learning. And he says, by the way, I've been through this process. I too was a son to my father, right? And my father taught me things, and my mother taught me things. So take a hold of what I'm going to share with you. Above all, right, get wisdom. Right? Knowing how to use what you know in a very wise way. Get understanding. And he goes on to this. He says in verse 7, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, though it cost all you have, get understanding. Okay? You want to figure this out, he says. You need this. Doesn't matter how much you're going to have to put into it, time and effort and energy. And he says it's worth it. Don't skimp out. Right? We have one of the wealthiest man ever, right, at that time, and wisest, saying, hey, pay attention. And he goes to this place in verse 25 and 26 of chapter 4, and he says, let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thoughts to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Or the New Living Translation puts it this way: look straight ahead and fix your eyes on what lies before you. Make a straight path for your feet and stay on the safe path. In other words, carefully consider where you're going. Pay attention to where you're going. Okay, he says, I'm going to give you a strategy to be successful in life. And what does that include? Well, you have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to where you are and where you want to get to. Right? Just as we know that an example I used was, if you wanted to go to Vancouver, BC, it's a whole different trip if you're coming from Portland, Oregon, or Winnipeg, Manitoba. Maybe you're heading to the same place in Vancouver, but the trip looks different depending on where you're at. And so you need to know that. So in other words, what I'm saying is that Solomon says that we need to live intentionally. We need to live with intentionality. Solomon is basically saying, watch your step. Pay attention. Pay attention to where you are. Pay attention to where you're going. Don't drift. Don't daydream. Pay attention. Right? We can get into all these things throughout the year, and we start to maybe lose our focus. We maybe got off track from the successful strategies of life that we've learned or we've heard. And he says, okay, let's stop. Let's pay attention. Let's focus. Let's look ahead. Where do we want to be? Where do you want to get to? And let's not sort of in a sense hit the ditch 25 times before you get there. Let's get a nice straight path. And this, you might say, the quickest way there and the safest way there. So this is what Solomon says. And when we think of the Magi, as at this time of the year in early January, as we know, the Magi, or the wise men, depending on your translation of the Bible you use, we know that they came after what we typically talk about as the nativity scene, in that time when Jesus is actually born. And so we know that the Magi were men of intention. They were paying attention to what was going on. So when that bright star, that star that showed up that didn't belong there, they were like, whoa, what's going on? And they did the research. They did what they needed to do. They spent the hours. They just didn't go back to sleep and go, oh, that's cool, and that was it. Not at all. There was like, whoa, something's going on. They were smart enough, wise enough, knowledgeable enough. They go, hey, this is important. We need to pay attention. Let's figure this out. And they did the research and they realized, whoa, this is about a king. And so they gathered all their stuff up with intention. They had to make plans. This wasn't just an overnight trip or an hour down the road. So they had to gather the people, the animals, the caravan, their supplies, all of that stuff. And because of where they were going, they realized, too, we need gifts because we're going to what? Worship this king. And so they put all this together with intention, right? They were not just, laissez-faire, just let's be casual. No, like we're going to see the king, right? And we might say, even when we think about worshiping on a Sunday morning with others, right? We're going to worship the king. What's our mentality? How do we come? We got there when we got there? Or do we come realizing we come with a purpose and a mission to praise, to worship, maybe to learn a few things, but also maybe to bless others with your presence, with the love that maybe you could share, maybe a word or whatever, right? There's a number of things that church is designed to do. And so we know that the wise men, they watched and they followed that star. And what do we know? It went to Jerusalem. And so they with intention, once again, they went in and tried to find out more information. And they find the right people, you might say, that knew some answers. They were sort of clued out. But when they did digging and when they went into the scriptures with intention, they found out the answer. And that helped the wise men, right? They were wise men. And what do we know about them? They went and then they were so happy. Weren't they? They were so happy when they left Jerusalem and there was the star leading them again once more to Bethlehem and right over the place. And we read in Matthew 1:10, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going in the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and they worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. To hear the intentionality of that. Right? Everything planned out. And you understand and think about their emotional state, you might say, with all that intentionality, with that planning, and when things came together, they were overjoyed. That is, they were filled with great joy. They were, you might say, beyond happy. And at this time of the year, we might be still saying Happy New Year, and we've just come through a period where we said Merry Christmas, this idea, Happy Christmas, Happy New Year, and what we see is these wise men, right? They were beyond happy because they had approached all of this with intentionality. They had followed the star to meet the real star of Christmas. And their purposeful, intentional approach yielded results. And it wasn't over then either. They might have thought, well, that's it. But you know what? These men were wise and they were on track. And what happens when they were ready to go home? They're warned in a dream. God continues to communicate with them just like he did and leads them by the star. What a magnificent, way to do this. And they're clued in. And then here, what do we see here? In a dream, they're told, you don't go back and talk to Herod, you go home by another way. And so that's exactly what they do. Intentionally, they go home by another route. God was still communicating with them. And now Proverbs, to go back to this, right? Proverbs is telling us, live with purpose, live with intention, not blindly going about our ways or just drifting, unaware of where we are, where we're going, or what we're doing, right? It's more than just survival, right? If we want to thrive, as God's intention is for us, you don't get there by drifting or even following what everybody else is doing, because that's often a really poor approach. So if we're going to do what verse 26 says, to give careful thought to the path for our feet, right? If we're going to mark out this path that we're going to take with our life for the next year or for longer and maybe shorter in between, if we're going to mark that path out so it's It's a good and safe path, right? We need to identify, we need to do this intentionally, right? Purposefully. Identify, well, where am I? And then identify, where do I want to go? And then we can talk about the process to get from where I am to where I want to go. And so where do we start with? If we want to know where we are right now, then we have to take an inventory of our lives. Businesses, often at the end of the year, they take an inventory. What do we have? Well, we have to be intentional and to identify where we are, to mark this out. We have to figure out where we are. So take an inventory of our lives. Where am I in different areas of my life? Where am I relationally? How am I doing in my relationships with my family, with my spouse, with my children, with my neighbors, with maybe the people in the church or people I work with, right? Relationally, where am I? Where am I in my relationship with God? Is it sliding because, well, I've been busy and we're not really, it's not like it used to be. Or never been good. But where am I? And we have to be honest about this and acknowledge what it is. Identify what it really is and accept what it is. It is what it is. And you need to do that before you can ever have a hope to get moving. And I think a lot of times that's what happens with people who don't fulfill their New Year's resolutions. It's because, hey, they are not honest enough to, with themselves and acknowledge where they really are at. And so think about yourself relationally and emotionally and mentally. Am I in a good headspace? Where am I emotionally? Where am I at financially? Where am I at physically? Am I eating well? Am I taking care of the body that God's given me? Am I exercising? Am I abusing my body, my mind? Am I developing my spiritual gifts and abilities? Where am I spiritually? Look at these vastly different areas of your lives that are all interconnected and take an inventory. Because you're a multifaceted, incredibly complex person. So take an inventory of where you're at. Identify what is true. Acknowledge it. So then we can start to talk about, in another time, where do I want to go? What is God calling me to? Where will I be successful? And so I want to invite you to a process that I have, that I try to do each year. And I start actually in the end of the year, and I start to reflect on how the years went and how that's been. And as I get older, I start to think more than just the year and think about my life more in general, but thinking about where I am. And then that sort of continues in, and I continue to reflect and take an inventory, right, to identify and to intentionally identify what's going on, take an inventory of my life. In the early weeks, maybe a week or two in the new year and so on, and then start to plan out and look about where I want to be, where maybe I had hoped to be, but I'm not. Or maybe something new is coming. Maybe there's a new goal. There's something new that God has opened up. But to be aware of that and then look at that and then to be able to develop a strategy, to develop the plans, to develop the goals, to help us go there. So we're looking down the road and we're going to make a straight path and we're going to get there. So I invite you to this week or weeks, begin to be intentional about your life and where you're at. Identify what's going on. Take an inventory. And so that you're aware of where you're at, so that we can take the next step and look ahead and go, where do I want to be? Where you might say, where has God already figured out that this is the successful way to life, as Solomon says. Hey, these aren't necessarily unknowns, but they need to be passed on. We don't necessarily just figure this out on our own, that they're through time, through God's passing this information on, through his word, through his people, there's lots that we can learn. So we're going to talk more about that in another one. But I invite you to join me in this process. Thanks for watching.